My father used to sit by the window every December just after dinner. He would sip his coffee lukewarm always and stare at the trees as if waiting for something. When I was young, I asked him once what he was thinking. He said, "That Sunday morning. It was too quiet." That's how I knew. He never talked much about the war, but that quiet stayed with him, and I grew up in its echo. Neighbors who served, photos in black and white, letters in boxes. I heard stories, some whispered, some broadcast through old radios that crackled like fire. I was not there when the bombs fell, but I remember how it felt to grow up in a world shaped by that sound. So tonight, if you are still awake, I want to tell you what I remember, not from living it, but from the voices that did. From the people who sat with me on porches around kitchen tables and sometimes just stared out the window. Close your eyes if you like. I will keep talking. This is the story of Pearl Harbor. America before the sirens. Before the sirens, before the smoke, before the headlines, there was just America resting. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, the country was catching its breath. The Great Depression had left bruises on every kitchen table and back porch, but by then most people had found a way to live again. Men were working. Women were keeping households stitched together. Radios were playing swing music. Baseball was loud again. If you were a kid back then, like my uncle was, the world seemed wide but safe. Saturdays meant movie theaters, and Sundays meant church roast dinners and maybe a drive if the car was behaving. People lined up for Coca-Cola in glass bottles. Jukeboxes were shiny, and jitterbug dancers had the energy of a nation trying to forget its worries. You remember how things felt in the mid-1990s, that strange blend of optimism and distraction. Maybe you had just gotten your first email. That is how it was hopeful busy, but just a little unaware of what was coming. International news that was background noise to most Americans. They heard about Europe, sure. Hitler was shouting somewhere. There was talk of invasions of Czechoslovakia, Poland, things far away. But it did not feel real. The Pacific even less so. Japan was a place most people could not find on a map, unless they had served in the Navy. To them, it was a land of silks and cherry blossoms, not aircraft carriers. They knew Japan had taken Manchuria, maybe heard something about China, but it felt like someone else's war. Most Americans did not want to get involved. They had just crawled out of the Depression. Another war. No thank you. That was the mood. Quiet resilience. Cautious recovery, a sense that the worst had already happened. And yet in places like Hawaii, where palm trees swayed, just off naval bases, things were shifting. Back on the mainland, towns were changing too. My father told me about small drills at schools, just in case they would say, but no one really believed anything would come of it. He used to laugh at the idea of needing a gas mask in Kansas. The only thing dropping from the sky there was rain, he said. But there was something else in the air, subtle, but there. Defense spending was creeping up. Industries were hiring again, especially out west. Airfields were expanding. Shipyards were loud. Some folks saw the writing on the wall. Most just saw work. You remember 2000, right? That year before everything shifted. People were making plans, buying homes, talking about the new millennium like it was the start of something shiny and clean. But then came September of the next year, and suddenly we all remembered that peace can vanish in a single morning. It was like that. Back in 1941, magazines featured smiling housewives, not gas masks. Kids memorized state capitals, not bombing drills. The war in Europe was a newspaper thing, not a neighborhood one. Roosevelt was trying to walk a tightrope, help the Allies, but not bring America into the fire. But fire has a way of finding dry wood. There were warning signs. Military planners raised concerns. A few politicians spoke up. But for most people, the sky was blue, the coffee was hot, and the news was someone else's problem. That is the America that existed before Pearl Harbor. Not naive, just human. My mother once said it best. We were not sleeping, she said, just dreaming. And soon we would all wake up. The world beyond the ocean. While Americans were dancing to Glenn Miller and arguing about who made the best apple pie on the block, the rest of the world was already unraveling. In Europe, things had gone dark. Germany had marched into Poland in 1939, and suddenly that part of the world was fire and fear. Britain and France declared war, but Hitler moved fast. Too fast. Blitzkrieg, they called it. Lightning war. Cities fell like dominoes. Paris was taken in 1940. London was burning by air raids night after night. The war felt like it was swallowing the continent. But if you were sitting in a diner in Ohio, reading the morning paper, it was easy to turn the page and focus on the comics. The pain was real, but it was also far away. The Atlantic was wide enough to feel like a wall. Over in Asia, though, the wall was already cracking. Japan had been on the move for years. My high school history teacher once said, Japan in the 1930s was like a match held too close to paper, ready to catch, determined to burn. They had taken Manchuria in 1931, moved into China in 1937, and by the early 1940s, they were pushing deeper, grabbing territory, like hungry hands at a table. It was not just war, it was expansion, ambition, empire. Japan wanted to control the Pacific, and to do that they needed resources, oil, rubber, steel, and they did not want to ask politely. The U.S. saw it coming, sort of. Sanctions were imposed, oil was restricted. Diplomats spoke in careful tones. But Japan was not backing down. They were planning something bigger, something bolder. And even as their envoys shook hands in Washington, their admirals were drawing lines on maps, thousands of miles away. I read once, maybe in an old book from the library, that the Japanese High Command knew they could not win a long war with the U.S., but if they could hit hard enough, fast enough, maybe America would hesitate. Maybe the blow would be too much to respond to quickly. That is how desperate nations think. In Germany, Hitler signed a pact with Japan and Italy. The Axis, they called themselves. Three powers united not by kindness or peace, but by conquest. Americans were watching, but cautiously. There were rallies, speeches, calls to stay out of it all. Isolationism was not a fringe idea, it was mainstream. People still remembered World War I. The trenches, the bodies, the sense that it had been for nothing. Roosevelt tried to help the Allies in small ways. Lend-lease programs, economic support. But he was careful. Most people did not want war. Not again. But the world has a way of pulling you in, whether you are ready or not. I remember a neighbor once said, we were sitting on the edge of a burning house, pretending the fire would not cross the fence. He was right. By late 1941, the fire was roaring. Hitler was rolling across Eastern Europe. Japan was eyeing Southeast Asia, and America was still deciding whether to stand up or sit back. Some knew the answer was coming, though. Military families stationed in Hawaii had already begun to feel it. Letters home spoke of tension, of drills, of a quiet unease. The Pacific was getting crowded with warships, and just beneath the surface, something was moving. Hawaii and Pearl Harbor, a paradise in uniform. If you ask most people today what they think of when they hear Hawaii, they might picture beaches, hula dancers, maybe a honeymoon from years past. But in 1941, Hawaii was something else entirely. It was not yet a state. It was a territory, far off the mainland but very much part of America's imagination. To the average American, it seemed like a paradise, blue water, palm trees, and soft air. But beneath that postcard image, Hawaii was a military machine in motion. Pearl Harbor sat like a giant steel heart in the middle of Oahu. It pumped ships instead of blood fueled by oil strategy and long hours. My father once described it as beautiful and dangerous at the same time. He had never been, but he knew people who had. They sent back letters with photos, sailors squinting in the sun buildings, surrounded by barbed wire families, living on base, with an eye always on the clock. Life on the island had a rhythm. Morning drills, maintenance runs, quick meals at the mess hall, officers walking with purpose, enlisted men on edge or bored out of their minds. There were dances on weekends, baseball games, when time allowed, and always that tension between tropical beauty and military readiness. Civilians lived there too, of course, locals who had made homes generations before alongside military families who were moved around like chess pieces. There were markets, schools, churches, all of it humming, alongside barracks and hangars. My uncle's best friend was stationed at Pearl Harbor in 41. He sent back a letter in October full of sunshine and stories. He wrote about how good the pineapples were, how hot the tarmac got by noon, and how sometimes it was easy to forget you were training for war when the sunsets were that perfect. But under the beauty there were signs, small ones. Increased patrols, tighter schedules, quiet meetings behind closed doors, and maybe a look in someone's eye that said, "We're here for a reason." The Pacific Fleet was America's answer to Japan's ambition. Battleships lined the harbor. Submarines moved in and out like clockwork. Planes filled the airfields, and radar, still a new thing back then, stood watch like a nervous sentinel. But not everyone trusted it. Some called it unreliable. Some just ignored it. That was the thing about Pearl. It was both fortress and target, a place built to protect and a place waiting to be tested. I read once that the sailors joked about boredom more than bombs. Long hours fixing things that were not yet broken, running drills that felt like theater. Most of them were young. Many had never been in combat. Some barely out of high school. They wore their uniforms with pride, but still laughed like teenagers. And the officers. They were watching the newspapers, watching Tokyo, and wondering when, if the day would come, because you do not gather that many ships in one place without drawing eyes, because paradise never stays untouched for long. Because even on an island, surrounded by beauty, you can still hear the hum of danger just beneath the waves. Quiet warnings. There is a certain kind of silence that only comes before something breaks. Pearl Harbor had that silence. The months leading up to December 1941 were filled with little warnings, small ripples that most people missed or chose not to believe. Hindsight makes them feel obvious, like blinking lights on a dashboard. But at the time, they just felt like noise in the background of a regular day. There were intelligence reports, of course, messages intercepted, ships spotted where they should not have been, ambassadors arriving late to meetings or avoiding questions. The military had suspicions always. You do not build a fleet in the middle of the Pacific without expecting someone might want to sink it. But the trouble with warnings is that they often come wrapped in routine. There was a memo in October that hinted at Japanese interest in Hawaii, a strange blip on radar one week, a coded message partially translated, but the dots never connected in time, or maybe people just did not want them to. My neighbor growing up, he served in naval intelligence later on, once told me, "The hardest thing in the world isn't spotting danger. It's convincing someone it's real before it hits." And that was Pearl in late 1941. Everyone knew something was coming. No one knew when or where or how hard. There was talk of the Philippines, maybe British holdings in Asia, but few believed the Japanese would strike directly at Hawaii. It felt too bold, too far, too American to touch. Besides, Washington was still talking with Tokyo. There were diplomats in suits shaking hands and passing notes. There were letters sent back and forth, all with the tone of "we're still trying." That gave people hope, or at least delay. But behind the curtain, Japan was making its final decisions. They needed oil, they needed rubber, they needed resources to keep their empire moving, and America's embargoes were squeezing hard. So they made a choice. Not one of peace, but of timing. They would attack. Not just to wound, but to shock. A first strike so sharp it would leave the U.S. stunned, maybe unwilling to fight back hard. And the target, it had to be Pearl. Meanwhile, on the island, life went on. On base, the men were still running drills, still cleaning their gear, still wondering whether mail from home would come that week. The nights were warm, the stars were bright, and the only sounds were the waves, the hum of machinery, and the occasional late-night laugh. But some people felt it, that tension in the air. Officers stayed at their desks later than usual. Ships seemed to move just a little faster. No one said it out loud, but there was a feeling like the last breath before the storm. I read somewhere that one sailor, just days before the attack, wrote home, "Feels like something's coming." Nothing you can point to. Just something. That something had already left Tokyo Bay. It was quiet. A fleet moving through the Pacific, under radio silence threading its way across thousands of miles of water. Carriers, cruisers, submarines, loaded with aircraft-trained pilots, orders sealed in envelopes. They were coming, and back in Pearl, the silence held. Calm skies, clear water, another day, another night, and then a Sunday, a morning like any other. Until it wasn't. Tokyo's decision. In the fall of 1941, as leaves turned on the streets of Washington and families picked out turkeys for Thanksgiving, a decision was being made across the Pacific. Not in a rush, not in a moment of fury, but slowly, methodically, with a kind of cold certainty that history does not easily forget. Japan knew time was running out. For years, their empire had grown. First Manchuria, then deeper into China. They had taken islands, ports, and pride. But all of that needed fuel, real physical fuel. Oil for ships, steel for tanks, rubber for boots. And America, in its quiet way, had begun to cut those lifelines. Embargoes were more than paper. They were pressure. Every barrel denied was a clock ticking down. Inside the highest halls of Japanese government, men in uniform sat across from men in robes. Generals, admirals, diplomats. Some argued for delay. Some warned of ruin. But in the end, the voices that won were the ones who believed in striking first. They did not want a long war. They wanted a short, sharp blow. Hit the United States hard enough, hit them in the heart, and maybe, just maybe, America would choose not to bleed out fighting. Maybe the shock would be so great, so sudden, that they would sit down instead of standing up. That was the hope. And so they planned. The operation was called I, though most people remember it simply as Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto, a man both brilliant and burdened, was tasked with designing the blow. He had studied in America. He had seen its factories, its spirit. He knew the sleeping giant better than most, and he feared it. But he also knew Japan had few options left. So, he drew up the plan. 6 aircraft carriers, over 400 planes, fighters, bombers, torpedo craft. They would sail in secret, maintain radio silence strike at dawn. Not just military targets, everything. Battleships, airfields, fuel reserves, communications. It was not just about winning a fight. It was about buying time. Cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet long enough for Japan to spread through Southeast Asia, secure the resources they needed, and dig in so deep that no one could dig them out. Back in Tokyo, the diplomats continued their meetings. They smiled. They nodded. They delivered letters carefully worded to suggest negotiation even as warships were already slicing through Pacific waves. It was all theater. A show meant to stall. My uncle once told me that the worst kind of danger is the kind you see too late. The kind that wears a suit while hiding a sword. In late November, the Japanese fleet left Hitokapu Bay. It was cold. The ships moved in silence, each man aboard, knowing the orders but few speaking of them. They crossed the ocean like shadows. No radio, no signals, just compasses, charts, and discipline. It took less than 2 weeks to reach the launch point north of Oahu, hidden beyond the horizon. Back in Hawaii, men played cards, wrote letters, slept. Some stood watch, but they were watching the wrong direction. The plan was for a Sunday. Americans would be relaxed, off guard. Planes would be parked wing to wing. Crews would be on half duty. And the water, Pearl itself, would be calm, still reflecting the morning sun. That was the moment they aimed for. And it was nearly here. I have read accounts from Japanese pilots. Some felt pride. Some felt doubt. One wrote in his journal the night before the attack, "If I die tomorrow, I hope my mother understands." They were not machines. They were young men following orders, believing their country's cause. Many did not return home. War rarely leaves heroes without shadows. But that night before the morning came, their engines were silent. Their bombs were loaded. And beneath the stars, the world held its breath. December 6th, 1941. Saturday moved slowly across Hawaii. The kind of warm golden day that makes you think nothing bad can happen. Sailors played catch on the grass between barracks. Families shopped in open-air markets. Radios hummed with music from the mainland. And kids begged their parents for one more hour outside before dinner. On the ships docked in Pearl Harbor, the mood was light. It was the weekend. Some men had liberty. Others were cleaning gear or finishing small maintenance tasks. A few were planning to attend church the next morning, same as always. One wrote in a letter, "Feels like nothing ever changes here. Same sunshine, same chow, same itch for something to do." You ever get that feeling on a quiet evening when the wind stops moving and everything feels too still? That was December 6th. Not in a dramatic way, just the kind of calm that only makes sense in hindsight. Back on the mainland, the talk was of football, winter coats, and Christmas lists. President Roosevelt was preparing a message for Japan, another diplomatic attempt. There was still a flicker of belief that maybe somehow conflict could be avoided. In Washington, Military intelligence was busy. Messages had been intercepted, fragments translated. There were warnings about a possible attack. Some said in Southeast Asia, maybe the Philippines. But no one expected Pearl. It was mentioned, yes, but not believed. Not really. That night in Hawaii, the base settled into its routine. Some sailors snuck cigarettes behind equipment sheds. A few stayed up late playing cards. Lights went out in the officers' quarters. The harbor itself shimmered under moonlight, calm and unsuspecting. Out at sea, just north of Oahu, the Japanese strike force reached its launch point. Carriers positioned themselves like hunters circling prey. Pilots were briefed one last time. Fuel lines were checked. Ammunition was loaded. Some men wrote short notes to families they might never see again. At 3:30 a.m., flight crews began preparing. Engines were warmed, cockpits checked. 2 waves of aircraft were organized over 350 planes in all. The first wave would focus on airfields and battleships. The second would finish the job. They launched just before dawn. On the island, radar operators picked up movement, lots of it, a swarm of blips. But the information was dismissed. It was assumed to be a group of American B-17 bombers scheduled to arrive from the mainland. Routine, expected. One of the young men manning the radar that morning later said, "We saw it. We called it in, but no one thought it was real. Not then." At 6:00 a.m., the Japanese submarine I-20 launched a midget sub toward the harbor. 5 of these mini-subs were part of the plan, sent in advance of the air attack. One was spotted and fired upon, but the warning was not passed along quickly enough. By the time the first Japanese aircraft crossed the coast of Oahu, the sun was just beginning to rise. And then came the moment that split history in two. A few minutes after 7:00 a.m., a Navy man spotted the planes and shouted, "That is not one of ours." He was right. Dive bombers screamed through the morning sky. Torpedo planes skimmed the water. Fighters dropped low, spraying gunfire across airfields. The sound was like nothing the island had ever heard. Before metal tearing air, explosions thudding through earth and water, sirens too late to stop anything. There was no formal declaration, no warning, just silence, then noise. It had begun. The morning the sky fell. At exactly 7:55 a.m. on Sunday, December 7, 1941, the quiet that had blanketed Pearl Harbor was torn open. People remember the sound first, not just the explosions, but the way the air changed. It went from still to heavy, from peaceful to shaking. The first bombs hit Battleship Row, slamming into the USS Arizona, the USS Oklahoma, and others moored tightly together, like steel giants resting. In seconds, fire leapt into the sky. Water turned black. Metal split like dry wood. Most of the sailors were still below deck. Some were shaving, others eating. A few were still in bed. There were no alarms before the first impact. By the time they reached topside, the sky was already swarming with planes. The first wave of Japanese aircraft struck with frightening precision. They knew where the ships were, how to approach, and how to hit. Torpedoes tore through the harbor's calm surface. Bombs cratered decks. Machine gun fire ripped across open fields and airstrips. It was fast, violent, relentless. On Ford Island, airmen ran for cover as hangars erupted in flames. At Hickam Field, rows of planes were lined up wing to wing, perfect targets. Some never got off the ground. The first few minutes were chaos, scrambling for weapons, for orders, for understanding. One sailor later said, "It felt like waking up in the middle of a nightmare, only you never remembered falling asleep." And yet in the middle of it all, people moved, fought, helped. On the USS Arizona, young men tried to get to the upper deck as the magazine below exploded, splitting the ship and sending a column of fire hundreds of feet into the air. More than 1,000 men died on that ship alone, many in an instant. Nearby sailors jumped into burning water to escape the flames, only to be pulled back onto other ships by strangers who did not even ask their names. Nurses at the naval hospital arrived in minutes, some still in civilian clothes, and worked non-stop under smoke and falling ash. One man said the oil on the water made the harbor look like it was bleeding. The attack came in 2 waves. The second struck at 8:40 a.m., adding new wounds to the already broken base. Fires spread from ship to ship. Destroyers capsized. Communications were shattered. In the air, a few American pilots managed to get airborne, engaging Japanese planes in short, desperate bursts. But they were outnumbered and outgunned. Across the island, civilians ducked under beds, behind doors, anywhere they could. Some thought it was a drill. Others thought the world was ending. The sound of engines and gunfire rolled over the hills like thunder that would not stop. Back in the harbor, the USS Oklahoma had rolled over completely, trapping hundreds of men inside. Some tapped on the hull from beneath, hoping someone above would hear. Some were rescued, many were not. By 10:00 a.m., the attack was over. In just under 2 hours, more than 2,400 Americans were dead. Nearly 1,200 more wounded. 21 ships damaged or destroyed. Hundreds of aircraft reduced to twisted frames. The harbor that had once glistened in postcard photos was now covered in smoke oil and silence. The Japanese lost 29 planes. They called it a success. Tactical, precise, historic. But history is not made in numbers. It is made in faces, in lives, in the long, slow breath after the shock, when you realize what has changed. Pearl Harbor was not just a military target. It was a symbol, a place, a heartbeat. And in one morning, that heartbeat stopped. Later that day, President Roosevelt would call it a date which would live in infamy. But for the people on the island, the ones who ran, fought, bled, and prayed, it was not history. It was morning, and the sky had fallen. The water turned black. When the last plane disappeared into the sky and the gunfire gave way to silence, there was a moment, brief, almost hollow, when the island did not move. It just breathed. And then came the sound of shouting, of boots on metal, of stretchers and sirens and hammers striking steel. The chaos of battle had ended, but something heavier had taken its place. Something slow. Something grim. The harbor, once calm and glistening, now swirled with smoke and oil. Flames still licked the surface of the water, dancing over the slick black sheen left behind by ruptured fuel tanks. The air was thick with its smoke heat and something else. The smell of war, my uncle called it. He said it stayed on your clothes, no matter how many times you washed them. Rescue crews moved quickly, instinct taking over. Some worked to cool the fires with hoses. Others crawled across scorched decks, listening for voices beneath twisted metal. From the capsized USS Oklahoma came a steady tapping, men trapped below the hull banging in Morse code, hoping someone would hear. Divers went into the water, not knowing what they would find. They moved through thick blackness, hands brushing past debris bodies. Sometimes hope. Some men were pulled out alive, some were not. At the naval hospital, wounded poured in. Burns, shrapnel, smoke inhalation. Nurses worked without pause. Surgeons operated in shifts, lit by backup generators when the power failed. They ran low on everything: bandages, morphine, clean water, but they kept going. No one complained. No one stopped. Civilians arrived with towels, blankets, food, whatever they had. Churches opened their doors. School teachers became medics. Teenagers volunteered as messengers. One woman I once met, who was just a girl at the time, said she remembered the adults all looked 10 years older by nightfall. The USS Arizona burned for 2 days. It still rests beneath the harbor, where it sank, where many of her crew remain. If you visit today, the water still leaks small trails of oil from the ship. They call it the Black Tears. Sailors who survived that morning carried memories they never spoke aloud. Some talked about what they saw. Others never did. A man from our neighborhood served on the USS West Virginia. He never told stories. But every year on December 7th, he would sit outside just before sunrise and not say a word. The island was quiet that night. No music, no laughter, just fire crews working through the dark and families staring at the sky, wondering if the planes would come back. Back on the mainland, no one knew yet. Radios were silent. Newspapers were blank. Telephones were slow. The rest of the country was still asleep, wrapped in a kind of peace that had already been shattered thousands of miles away. And in that stillness on that island, the water remained dark, not just with oil or smoke, but with the weight of what had happened, what had changed, what could never be undone. Someone once told me that after a tragedy, the world keeps moving, but the light bends a little differently. That day, the light bent over Pearl Harbor, and in its reflection, America began to see something it could no longer ignore. America reacts on the mainland. It was still early Sunday when the first news bulletins began to crackle through radios. Most Americans were at church or reading the paper, or sitting at breakfast with bacon on the stove and toast in the oven. Then came the sound, those clipped, urgent voices interrupting swing music and baseball scores. We interrupt this broadcast. People froze. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Coffee cups hovered in midair. Radios were turned up. Neighbors called across fences. Something had happened. Something far away, and yet suddenly so close. Pearl Harbor attacked. Japanese planes. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Battleships hit. Casualties unknown. At first, some did not believe it. A few thought it was a dramatization, a radio play gone too far. But the voices kept coming. Calm, firm, and unmistakably real. I remember hearing that my grandmother stood in the kitchen with her hand on the radio, like holding it, might change the words. She did not speak. She just listened. Over and over. The country shifted in a matter of minutes. People rushed to buy newspapers only to find the presses had not caught up yet. Others gathered around store windows where radios had been placed near open doors. Crowds formed. Strangers held hands. Tears came quick and without permission. Church bells rang, not for celebration, but for summoning. Within hours, places of worship were filled again, this time with silence and prayer. President Roosevelt met with his advisors immediately. His face was pale but steady. There was no question of whether to respond, only how and how soon. By afternoon, American flags were lowered to half-staff across the nation. Newsboys shouted headlines on every corner. In one of those old black-and-white photos, you can see a man standing in Times Square, holding a paper that reads simply, "War." Phones rang endlessly. Military offices were flooded with volunteers. Boys lied about their age. Men pulled old uniforms from attics. Women offered to sew, to nurse, to work. It was not just anger, it was clarity. The disbelief melted fast. In its place came resolve. Americans, whether they had wanted war or not, understood now that it had arrived. Not in a distant land, not in someone else's story, but here, with fire and noise and loss. Radio announcers described the attack in careful detail. They read casualty estimates, listed the ships damaged, played clips of Roosevelt's upcoming address, and through it all there was that tone, a mixture of sorrow steel and something new: unity. One station in Chicago played God Bless America every hour on the hour. A bar in St. Louis stopped serving alcohol and handed out black armbands instead. School children in rural towns asked their teachers, "Where is Hawaii?" and then quietly drew American flags on the corners of their homework. We did not know everything yet. We did not know about the losses in full or the scope of the Japanese plan. We did not know what it would cost to fight back. But we knew one thing: the war had come, and it had chosen us. That Sunday ended with a kind of silence, not fear exactly, something deeper. A national breath held in unison, and somewhere far away from radios and headlines, Pearl Harbor still smoldered. America had been struck, but it had not been broken. Not yet. Not ever. The day after Monday, December 8, 1941, began with a country that was no longer quite the same. Dawn broke over a different America, an America that had gone to sleep stunned and woken up steady. The disbelief was still there, like a fog hanging low, but beneath it was something sharper: determination, purpose, a rising kind of stillness, the kind that comes just before a great movement begins. People turned on radios before coffee. They skipped breakfast, skipped newspapers. They just listened. There was only one voice the country wanted to hear. At noon, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress. The House chamber was packed, shoulder to shoulder, standing room only. Outside, crowds gathered in the streets, clinging to every word from loudspeakers and radios. He spoke with his usual calm, but there was iron underneath it. Yesterday, he began December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. You have heard that phrase before, of course. Everyone has. But back then, it was brand new. Each syllable landed like a step forward. He spoke not as a politician, not even as a president, but as a man speaking for a wounded family. He did not yell. He did not beg. He simply told the truth. And then he asked Congress to declare war. It took them less than an hour to say yes. Just one vote against. Just one. People in the streets cheered, but it was not celebration. It was release. Something terrible had happened, and now there was something to do about it. The waiting was over. That afternoon, my father told me every store on Main Street in his town shut down early. Not for mourning, but for marching. Men lined up outside the post office and recruitment centers. Teenagers begged their parents to let them go. Some did not ask permission. Women began organizing immediately sewing drives, first aid training, blood donations. Churches opened for vigils. Town halls turned into planning centers in places like Iowa, Alabama, Oregon, places nowhere near the Pacific. People acted like the war had landed on their front lawns. There was no talk of staying out anymore. Isolationism had vanished overnight like steam off a morning window. The newspapers were full of photos: the USS Arizona in flames, a sailor helping a wounded man across the deck, a pilot's helmet floating in water. Headlines screamed in bold print: "We are, attack, infamy." Roosevelt's speech was reprinted in full. Teachers read it aloud in classrooms. Parents read it at dinner tables. And in homes across the country, the maps came out. People found Hawaii, then Japan, then the Philippines. For the first time, those faraway names became part of their world. My mother remembered listening to the speech at school. She said even the kids stopped fidgeting. Even the teacher had tears in her eyes. Across the ocean in London, Churchill heard the news and said, "So we have won after all." Because he knew once America was in the war, had turned. But no one knew yet how long it would last, or how many would be lost. The day after Pearl Harbor was not just the start of war, it was the start of transformation. America would build ships by the thousands, planes by the tens of thousands. Women would work steel and rivets. Men would leave farms and desks for front lines. Families would write letters they hoped would not be the last. The country had been wounded, but now it was moving. The next chapter had begun, and it would be written not just in ink, but in sweat, sacrifice, and steel. The Enlistment Lines. In the days following the attack, the lines began to form, not for bread, not for gas, but for war. Outside recruitment centers from Boston to Bakersfield, men stood shoulder to shoulder in their coats and caps, waiting to sign their names. Some were quiet, some were nervous. Some cracked jokes just to keep their hands from shaking. They brought with them sandwiches, folded letters from home, and eyes that had only just stopped blinking from the shock of Sunday morning. My uncle was one of them. 20 years old, lanky, stubborn, always the first to run toward trouble. He had planned to go to college. After December 7th, he planned to go to war instead. He did not ask for advice. He told his mother at breakfast, stood up, and walked out the door. He came back 2 hours later with a form in his hand and a ship date in his pocket. All across the country, it was the same story. Men lied about their age, some up, some down. Fathers enlisted beside their sons. Some brought friends with them. Others came alone with nothing but a name and a will to fight. In one photograph I once saw in a library, the line wrapped around an entire city block. The caption read, "Chicago, December 9th." But it could have been anywhere. The draft had already been in place before the attack. But now, it was something else. Now it was personal. It was not just orders. It was volunteers. Young men who had never left their county were ready to cross oceans. Farm boys, shoe clerks, teachers, truck drivers, all ready to trade names for serial numbers, hometowns for battlefields. They did not know what they were walking into. No one really did. The war had just begun, and the maps were still being redrawn. Basic training centers swelled overnight. Barracks filled. Uniforms were handed out by the truckload. Inexperienced officers were told to make soldiers out of schoolboys in 8 weeks flat. It was fast, messy, imperfect. But it was moving. There was excitement in the air, yes. But it was a nervous kind, like stepping into a storm, because standing still felt worse. Back home, families learned to let go in stages. First came the goodbye at the door. Then came the postcard. Then silence. My grandmother kept a calendar where she marked the days between letters from her brother. When the gaps grew wider, she stopped marking them altogether. Women packed care boxes with socks and soap. Churches organized letter-writing drives. Little sisters gave away their favorite candy bars because he might need the sugar more. Some men never made it through training. Accidents happened, illness, but most pushed through because there was no turning back and nothing to return to yet. My uncle ended up in the Pacific. He wrote once every 2 weeks, folding his words tight like secrets. He never said much. Doing fine, food's okay. Tell Mom not to worry. But between the lines, you could feel it. The weight, the distance. He came home years later thinner and quieter, with a medal he never explained, and a limp he said was from slipping on wet deck boards. We never pushed him for more. What I remember is how proud my father was when his brother enlisted. He stood a little taller that day, not because he wanted war, but because he understood what had to be done. That is what those lines meant. Not glory, not revenge, just resolve. They did not know where they were headed, but they knew why. And for most, that was enough. Life on the home front. While the men shipped out life back home, shifted into something new, something no one had entirely planned for, but everyone felt coming. The rhythm of daily life was still there. School bells, factory whistles, the morning milk delivery, but underneath it all was a quiet pulse of urgency. You could feel it in the way people walked faster, talked shorter, paused, less. Everything mattered now, even the small things. Rationing began almost immediately. Gasoline, sugar, coffee, meat, rubber, shoes. Families received little books with coupons, each one good for a week's worth of something. You did not waste. You did not complain. You folded the paper bags to reuse them. You stretched the stew another night. You made do. My mother said the first time she saw a sign in a store window that read, "Closed for the duration." She didn't fully understand what it meant. Not until more signs followed. Not until the movie theater cut back its hours. Not until her favorite candy disappeared from shelves without warning. Then it hit. The duration was not just a word. It was a promise, a suspension of normal life held in place until the war let go. Women stepped forward not in speeches, but in steel. They worked in factories building planes and bullets, welding pieces of ships that would soon carry their brothers across oceans. They tied back their hair, rolled up their sleeves, and clocked in. They were not waiting for history to happen. They were making it. Rosie the Riveter was not a poster in those days. She was real. She stood in line behind you at the market. She babysat your cousins. She sat beside you at church on Sunday and worked the assembly line on Monday. Children collected scrap metal. They gathered rubber bands, old tires, kitchen grease. There were neighborhood contests who could gather more, who could help more. Not because they were told, but because it felt like they were part of something bigger. Schools taught first aid alongside math. Fire drills were joined by blackout drills. Windows were taped in excess to prevent glass from shattering if the worst ever came. People dug victory gardens in their backyards, growing carrots and beans where lawns used to be. Every tomato was a small rebellion against hunger. News came from the radio. Big wooden boxes that glowed in the evening, casting orange light on faces, leaning in close. Every night, families sat together to listen. War updates, reports from the front, and the occasional bit of music to remind them that life still moved. Sometimes the letters from overseas were cheerful. Sometimes they were not. And sometimes they stopped coming altogether. The mailman became both hope and dread. People watched his steps like omens. There were gold stars in windows, not many at first, but enough to know what they meant. My grandmother once said, the hardest part was not knowing. Not knowing when it would end. Not knowing who would come back. Not knowing whether the face you kissed goodbye would still be the same if it returned. But they did what they had to do. They worked. They waited. They watched the sky and prayed that the war would not find its way to their street. Not everyone fought on the battlefield, but everyone was in the fight. And on the home front, bravery looked like staying steady when everything inside you wanted to break. The Japanese-American story. There is another part of this story, a quieter one, a darker one, that often sat in the background of the headlines. While most Americans were wrapping bandages and raising flags, some Americans were quietly being told they no longer belonged. Japanese Americans had lived on the West Coast for decades. They built businesses, worked farms, raised families. Many were born in the United States. They spoke English, pledged allegiance, played baseball. But after Pearl Harbor, none of that seemed to matter. Fear has a way of turning neighbors into strangers. In the days after the attack, suspicion spread like smoke. Newspapers ran stories filled with rumor. Politicians demanded answers. Radio voices whispered about sabotage, about spies, about threats from within. It did not take much, just a few loud voices and a lot of silence for fear to find its target. By February 1942, just 2 months after the bombs fell, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. It allowed the military to designate areas as exclusion zones, and soon after, more than 100,000 Japanese Americans were forced to leave their homes. They were told to pack light. 2 suitcases. Take what you could carry. Leave the rest. I remember hearing about one family from California, parents and 2 children. They ran a corner grocery store. One morning they were there behind the counter weighing fruit and sweeping the steps. The next, the store was boarded up, and they were gone. No warning, no trial, just orders. The government called them relocation centers. Others called them internment camps. But to the people inside, they were barbed wire fences, watchtowers, long lines, shared latrines, and a cold that settled deep into your bones. Some camps were built in deserts, others in swamps. Most were in places where no one else wanted to be. Families slept in horse stalls and barracks behind tar paper walls. Privacy was a memory. Dignity was rationed. And still they made it a life. They formed schools, built gardens, held dances, published newspapers, painted murals on the walls. One boy carved birds from scrap wood and gave them to children who cried at night. One woman grew flowers from seeds she smuggled in her coat pocket. That was the American spirit too, just in a place where the flag flew over locked gates. Many young Japanese American men, despite what was being done to their families, volunteered to fight for the same country that had imprisoned them. They formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. It became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history for its size and length of service. They fought in Europe in the cold and the mud, while their parents lived behind fences. And still they went. Still they served. After the war, many of those families returned to find their homes sold, their businesses gone, their names forgotten. It took decades before the government offered a formal apology, before a president stood up and said, "We were wrong." But even then, the damage was already woven into the fabric of what had been lost. I once met a woman who had been a girl in those camps. She smiled easily, but there was something in her eyes, like she still had a suitcase packed just in case. History is not always fair. It does not always honor who it should. But if we are telling the story of America, of what Pearl Harbor meant, of what the war changed, we have to tell this part too. Because patriotism is not just about raising a flag. Sometimes it is about holding on to hope in the very place where that flag no longer protects you. And even there, even then, they endured. Quietly. Proudly. Unshaken. The Pacific ignites. The attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't the end of something. It was the spark, the match that lit the fuse. Because while Americans were still pulling sailors from the harbor and holding their breath for what came next, Japan was already moving. Pearl Harbor was only one piece of the plan. On the same day, December 7, 1941, across the international dateline, it was already December 8 in much of Asia, and the Japanese forces struck like a tide coming in all at once. They attacked the Philippines, where American and Filipino troops were stationed under General Douglas MacArthur. The airfields were bombed, the planes destroyed before they could take off. Within hours, the invasion had begun. Soldiers who had been eating breakfast one minute were fighting for their lives the next. Hong Kong, Malaya, Guam, Wake Island, Thailand, Burma, all hit, all in motion. Within 48 hours, the entire Pacific seemed to shift on its axis. The Japanese military moved with terrifying speed, experienced, precise, and unrelenting. They weren't just fighting battles. They were taking land, territory, control. It was empire executed in real time. Their strategy was simple: hit hard, move fast, dig deep. Take what they needed: oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, rubber in Malaya, control of the shipping lanes, and build a perimeter so strong that the United States could never break through. It almost worked. In those early months, Japan won victory after victory. American and British forces were overwhelmed, scattered, pushed back. Bases fell, ships sank, entire islands were lost. Morale dropped like an anchor. Back home, the headlines came fast and grim. Bataan falls, Corregidor lost, Singapore surrenders. One woman I met years ago said she remembered opening the paper and seeing a new city fall every morning, like pins on a map she could not pronounce. She kept a globe on her desk, and each day she'd spin it to find where the war had reached now. The fear was real. For a time, some worried that Japan might even strike the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington. Air raid sirens were tested. Blackout curtains were installed. Coastal towns held drills. A Japanese submarine shelled an oil refinery near Santa Barbara in February 1942. It caused little damage but rattled nerves across the nation. The Pacific was burning, and America was trying to catch up. But something else was building too. Not just fear resolve, the kind that grows slowly like muscle. The kind you feel when you've been knocked flat, but start to push yourself up anyway. Factories back home went into overdrive. New ships were laid down. Planes rolled off assembly lines day and night. The war machine was moving, and out in the Pacific, the U.S. Navy, battered but not broken, began to regroup. Survivors from Pearl Harbor returned to duty. New recruits filled the ranks. Submarines started sinking enemy ships. Intelligence officers began breaking codes. The tide had not turned. Not yet. But the current had met resistance. The Pacific would not be a short war. It would be island by island, wave by wave, each one paid for in blood and steel. And the first victories were still far ahead. But they were coming. Because in every harbor, every hangar, every quiet town, where a mother lit a candle or a child whispered a prayer, something had awakened. The war was not over. It had just begun. And now, America was wide awake. Midway turning the tide. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese Empire was riding high. Their flag flew over territory that stretched thousands of miles. From the beaches of Southeast Asia to the jungles of the Philippines, they seemed unstoppable. The attack on Pearl Harbor had bought them the time they needed, or so they thought. But the ocean has a way of shifting, quietly, suddenly, and then came Midway. It is easy now to look back and call it a turning point, a pivot. But at the time, it was a gamble. A sharp, desperate bet by both sides in a war that had no clear end. The Japanese wanted to finish the job. Pearl Harbor had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet but not destroyed it. Aircraft carriers, the new kings of naval warfare, had not been in port that day. America still had them, and that was a problem. So Admiral Yamamoto crafted a plan to lure the U.S. carriers into a trap. The Japanese would attack Midway, a small but strategic island northwest of Hawaii. The U.S. would be forced to respond. And then once they arrived, the Japanese fleet would pounce, overwhelming and sinking what was left of America's naval power in the Pacific. It was bold, precise, and almost brilliant, except America was listening. Through broken Japanese code intercepted by naval intelligence, U.S. commanders discovered the plan. They knew the date, the location, even the number of carriers headed their way. It was not luck. It was hard work. Long hours and quiet brilliance from people hunched over typewriters and wires in dimly lit rooms. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the man now responsible for the Pacific Fleet, made his own gamble. He positioned 3 U.S. carriers, Enterprise Hornet and the quickly repaired Yorktown, just northeast of Midway, hidden and waiting. On June 4, 1942, the Japanese launched their first wave of aircraft, bombarding Midway with fire and thunder. But the island's defenses held better than expected, and as the Japanese scrambled to rearm for a second strike, the U.S. carriers made their move. American dive bombers appeared out of the sky like ghosts. They struck fast, and they struck deep. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi Kaga and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. A 4th Hiryu was sunk later that day. The heart of the Japanese fleet was broken, not over months, but in a single afternoon. It was not a perfect victory. The U.S. lost the Yorktown, along with over 100 brave airmen and sailors. But strategically, it was enormous. Japan had lost 4 of its best carrier ships that had taken years to build and would take years more to replace. From that moment forward, Japan was no longer on the offensive. The empire that had expanded so quickly began to shrink. Back home, the victory at Midway lifted spirits. It wasn't just a win, it was proof. Proof that the tide could turn, that the war could be fought and won. The newspapers reported it carefully. Military censors kept details vague to protect intelligence. But the message was clear enough. America had stood toe-to-toe with Japan and struck back. I once heard a veteran say that after Midway, the men stopped talking about if we win. They started saying when. And though the road ahead would still be long and brutal, and marked by names like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa Midway, was the moment America stopped falling back and began to lean forward. It did not end the war, but it changed its direction. And in war, sometimes, that is everything. Guadalcanal and the grind of war. Midway had shifted the tide, yes, but turning the tide and riding it are 2 different things. Because what came next was not a single glorious battle. It was a grind, a slow, brutal crawl across islands most Americans had never heard of. Names like Tarawa, Saipan, Bougainville, now etched into memory by sweat, blood, and jungle rot. And it began with Guadalcanal. In August 1942, just 2 months after Midway, American Marines landed on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. It was the first major offensive by Allied forces in the Pacific, and no one really knew how it would go. The goal was to seize a Japanese airfield under construction, later called Henderson Field. Control of that airfield meant control of the surrounding skies. Control of the skies meant slowing Japan's push across the South Pacific. Simple in theory, brutal in reality. The jungle was thick, the heat unbearable. Mosquitoes buzzed constantly, bringing disease that moved faster than bullets. Supplies were scarce. Water was worse. Food spoiled quickly, and men often lived on little more than rice, canned meat, and hope. The Japanese were dug in, experienced, and determined to hold the island. What followed was 6 months of savage seesaw fighting. By day, artillery. By night, attacks through the trees, sometimes hand-to-hand, sometimes face-to-face. Always close, always personal. Ships clashed off the coast in bloody naval battles. Planes fought overhead in chaotic dogfights. Reinforcements arrived in waves, both sides trying to tip the balance with fresh boots and steel. And through it all, the Marines held, with little rest, with even less certainty. But they held. One soldier wrote home, "There are nights when I do not sleep, not because of fear, but because the jungle won't stop moving." Back in the States, families followed the news with anxious eyes. Guadalcanal was not as famous as Pearl Harbor. It didn't have the clean story arc of Midway, but it mattered. It was proof that America could not only defend, but take back. When the Japanese finally evacuated the island in early 1943, it marked the end of their expansion. For the first time, Japan was retreating, and for the first time, American troops had claimed ground, not in defense, but in defiance. The cost was high. Nearly 7,000 Americans died. Over 25,000 were wounded or fell sick. The Japanese lost even more. And the island, just one small piece of earth in a vast ocean, was left soaked in memory. Guadalcanal set the tone for the rest of the war in the Pacific. It was not going to be quick. It was not going to be clean. It would be island by island, inch by inch, in the mud and in the heat against an enemy that did not give up easily. I once heard a Marine from Guadalcanal say, "We didn't win because we were stronger. We won because we refused to stop." That's the truth of it. Victory didn't come from a single moment of brilliance. It came from thousands of small ones' decisions to stand, to crawl forward, to hold the line one more day. The war was still far from over. But now, with Guadalcanal behind them, the men knew the way forward, and they would not stop. Island by island. After Guadalcanal, there was no turning back. The strategy had a name now, island hopping. But for the men doing it, it just meant another patch of land, another fight, another goodbye to the quiet of home. The Pacific wasn't just a battlefield. It was a maze of coral heat and time. And every island, no matter how small on a map, held deep trenches, hidden guns, and defenders who would not surrender. The Allies chose their targets carefully. Not every island needed to be taken. Some were bypassed, isolated, left to wither. Others were deemed essential airfield supply lines, launch points, for the final push toward Japan. Each landing was its own kind of hell. At Tarawa, in late 1943, Marines waded through chest-deep water under machine gun fire, their landing craft stuck on coral reefs. It took just 3 days to take the island, but more than 1,000 Americans were killed. When the photos reached home, they shocked the nation. The sand was stained dark. The cost was becoming visible. At Saipan, they fought not just soldiers, but civilians. Japanese propaganda had convinced many that Americans would torture or kill them. Hundreds jumped from cliffs into the sea, rather than be captured. U.S. troops tried to stop them. Some cried watching it happen. One man said it was the first time he truly hated war. Pilelu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each worse than the last. On Iwo Jima, the Japanese had turned the island into a fortress. Tunnels, bunkers, hidden artillery. The fighting lasted over a month. Almost 7,000 Americans died. Nearly every Japanese soldier was killed. That's where the photo was taken, the one you've seen, of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi. It became a symbol, a moment of pride. But even that day, the battle was far from over. At Okinawa, the last major island before Japan itself, the cost was staggering. More than 12,000 Americans killed, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians dead. Kamikaze pilots slammed into U.S. ships. Rain turned the ground to muck. Shells fell like thunder for weeks. Okinawa wasn't just a battle. It was a warning. If this was what it took to take one island, what would it cost to invade the Japanese mainland? That question began to haunt the minds of generals, of politicians, of Roosevelt himself. The closer America got to Japan, the clearer it became. Japan would not surrender easily. Back home, the war effort never slowed. More factories, more rationing, more telegrams with the worst kind of news. But there was also pride, determination. People knew the end was near, even if no one knew how near, or what the end might look like. One soldier, just 19 years old, wrote to his sister after surviving Iwo Jima. "We're close, I think. I can feel it. But there's a shadow hanging over everything now. Like we're about to win, but lose something too." He wasn't wrong. By mid-1945, American forces stood at Japan's doorstep. The fleet surrounded the home islands. Bombers flew regular missions over Tokyo. The noose was tightening, but Japan would not yield. And so the world stood still, waiting to see what would come next. No one could yet imagine the decision, waiting just over the horizon. Not the men still digging foxholes. Not the mothers counting stars in windows. Not even the president. But it was coming. The final act of the war, and with it, a moment that would change history forever. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the final blow. By the summer of 1945, Japan stood alone. Germany had surrendered in May. Victory in Europe had brought parades, relief, and tears, but not rest. For the United States, the war was only half finished. The Pacific still burned. And the fight for Japan, everyone knew, would be the hardest yet. American planes were already bombing Japanese cities. Night after night, they flew over Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, dropping incendiaries that turned wooden homes into firestorms. Thousands died. Still, Japan did not surrender. The Japanese military had dug in. The civilian population was being trained to resist invasion, children with bamboo spears, old men building defenses in their gardens. It would not be another island campaign. It would be a bloodbath. Estimates for an invasion ran high hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties, perhaps millions of Japanese. And in that shadow, a decision was made. It wasn't born in the Pacific or on a battlefield. It had started years earlier in deep laboratories and desert towns, under a project so secret most Americans didn't know it existed. The Manhattan Project. Scientists, some of the best minds in the world, had been racing to harness the power of the atom. What they built wasn't just a weapon. It was a threshold, a doorway, one that could not be closed once opened. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, the first atomic bomb was tested. The explosion lit the sky with a new kind of fire. One scientist whispered, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." 3 weeks later, President Harry S. Truman, newly in office after Roosevelt's sudden death, made the call. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., a U.S. B-29 bomber named Enola Gay released its payload over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The bomb exploded 2,000 feet above the ground. In seconds, the city vanished into light heat and silence. Tens of thousands died instantly. Thousands more would die in the hours, days, and months to come from burns, from radiation, from a kind of suffering the world had never known before. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. And then, silence. Not the silence of peace. Not yet, but the silence of something too large to understand. Back in the States, people cheered. The war was ending. The headlines screamed victory. But even then, some people paused. Some wondered what had been unleashed. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. Emperor Hirohito's voice, heard for the first time ever by his people, told the nation that the war was over. He did not say the word defeat, but he said the word endure, and so it ended. On September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the formal surrender. American generals stood in full uniform. Cameras clicked. The Pacific was still for once. And just like that, after nearly 4 years of fire steel and sacrifice, the war was over. But the peace that followed would never be simple. Cities had been erased. Millions were dead. A new world had begun, one where humanity now held the power to end itself. I once met a man who served in the Pacific. He told me we won, yes. But when I saw the photos from Hiroshima, I wondered what we'd lost to win. There are no easy answers in that chapter, only questions we still ask today. But one thing was certain. The war that started with a surprise at Pearl Harbor had ended with a silence that echoed across the world. It started with a morning, quiet, sunny, a harbor full of ships, and then fire. From that single day in December 1941, history shifted, not just for the men who stood on the decks or the families who ran into the streets that morning, but for a nation, for a world. Pearl Harbor wasn't just a place anymore. It was a beginning, a door opening into a war that would touch every continent, every ocean, every home. Some people remember the war through photographs, black and white stills of soldiers kissing sweethearts or flags raised in victory. Others remember through names carved into stone-folded flags on mantels, or the silence in a father's eyes when asked, "What was it like?" But there's something else that lingers, something quieter. It's the sound of a radio in the dark, the soft crackle of a voice saying, "We interrupt this broadcast," the rustle of ration books, the thump of boots boarding a train, the hush of a letter being opened at the kitchen table. History lives in those moments, not just in battles, but in the waiting, not just in the speeches, but in the whispers, in the questions that never got answered. You know, sometimes I think about the sailors who woke up that morning in Hawaii thinking it would be just another Sunday, thinking they might go to church or write home or take a photograph with friends. Some of them never even had time to put on their shoes. And yet somehow the country moved forward. Broken, bruised, but not beaten. We built. We fought. We changed. And when the smoke cleared, when the guns quieted, and the world tried to make sense of what had happened, we were not the same. Could not be. Should not be. Because war does that. It reshapes not just borders, but memory. It makes you look at your neighbor differently. It makes you treasure the sound of your child breathing in the next room. It teaches you the value of peace by showing you what its absence feels like. So tonight, as you close your eyes and the day fades behind you, remember this. What began at Pearl Harbor was not just war. It was courage. It was loss. It was resolve. It was the long, painful journey toward peace. And though the world has turned many times, since that day the echo still reaches us across time, across generations, like a ripple on quiet water. Thank you for being here with me tonight. Sleep well, and good night.